Good afternoon, evening or morning, wherever you may be. My name is Mark Fitzgerald, Principal of Meridian Lawyers, an Australian law firm that provides legal services to insurers and their insureds, insurance intermediaries and their clients, and other insurance industry participants. I would like to start by thanking the National Insurance Brokers Association Victoria Committee for inviting us to be their partner for Dive In 2022. We are proud to be partnering with you in sponsoring and hosting this afternoon's session on building braver workplace cultures in a post-pandemic world. COVID-19 has impacted our lives, both personally and professionally, in ways that we could never have imagined. It has changed the way we live and how we interact with each other. Hybrid working is here to stay. It has quickly become part of the fabric of how we work. It has presented and will continue to present challenges and opportunities. We are delighted today to introduce you to Professor Frederik Anseel. I will now hand over to Prudence Chang of the NIBA Victoria Committee to say a few words about NIBA and Frederik. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. As Mark said, my name is Prudence Chang and I'm the Executive Manager of Business Development and Partners at National Credit Insurance. But I've also been on the NIBA Victorian Committee for a decade and I'm so happy to be celebrating the Dive In Festival with you today. NIBA represents 450 member firms and approximately 15,000 brokers, including large multinational insurance brokers, Australian broker networks, and small to medium-sized businesses in cities and regional areas throughout Australia. NIBA works in the interest of its members and thanks Meridian Lawyers, of course, for the sponsorship for today. As I said earlier, we're here to talk to Frederik, and of course, I was lucky enough to hear him speak at the University of New South Wales, where his knowledge and understanding of how COVID has affected businesses and our ability to pivot our working habits is second to none. Today, he will share key learnings from his research and teachings. Frederik is also a Professor of Management and Senior Deputy of Dean, Research and Enterprise at the University of New South Wales Business School, Sydney. Previously, he was the Vice Dean Research at King's College London, Head Department at Garrett University, Belgium, and also has held positions in universities throughout France, Italy, and the Netherlands. Currently, he serves as the President of the European Association of Work and Organisational Psychology and is elected Fellow of the International Association of Applied Psychology. His research has been published in more journals than I could actually count. And as a speaker, he has been called upon to discuss his thoughts with a wide audience, as diverse as business leaders and students, a true affirmation of his ability to turn complex ideas into terms mere mortals such as myself can actually understand. I would like you to welcome, of course, Frederik. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Prudence. That is quite the introduction. Thank you very much. And welcome everyone. I'm very happy to be able to join you today. For people that are here live, it's great to be live, but I understand that also people will be listening to a recording afterwards. So let me quickly see if I can share my screen here. There we go. So today I'll talk about hybrid workplaces and the cultural change that is happening and that is required for us to thrive in that sort of this sort of new workplace cultures. I'll talk a bit about recent research insights. Sometimes I'll highlight where there's no research yet, where we're still sort of exploring and discovering and experimenting with new ways of working. I'll take a bit of a global perspective. Across the world, this has been a global shock, and we've all went through the same sort of shocks and phenomenon at different times, but basically most of us have experienced the same thing. And so I'll just jump in, right? And what I propose to do is actually take a step back and ask you to sort of think back in, let's say, February 2020. That was just before COVID. And imagine that I had asked you at that time, what would happen with your job and also what would happen with your company if you would be asked to work online entirely, the whole company, overnight. And I'm pretty sure if I had asked you at that time what would happen, you would say that is a disaster, that will never work, right? Of course, now with the benefit of hindsight, we know that things worked out just fine. But if you think back what happened at that time, that was incredible. So I'm asking you to step back and let's think, what have we learned? And I'm sort of summarizing that in 3 categories. I would say, what have we learned? The good, the bad, and the ugly. So let's start with the good thing. So as I just told you, most of us in, let's say, January, February 2020 were not very familiar with Teams, Zoom, Google Hangouts. That was all new to us, right? We did some sort of meetings online, but not a lot. And some people were already working from home, but not a lot of people. And suddenly we had COVID hitting us at different places in the world at different times, but we had the same experience. If you were in Australia, like I am, or if you were in Europe or in the United States, at some point there were lockdowns and people needed to work from home. There was panic. There was a lot of anxiety and people needed to self-isolate and work from home. And it was incredible. It was incredible because it worked much better than anyone had ever imagined. And so what we saw is this shift to remote work, sometimes overnight, sometimes over a matter of weeks. And we found out that actually we were pretty good in collaborating with each other and coordinating work. And we quickly found a new rhythm, new routines. We had standing meetings, we had catch-ups with people, we had social hours online, and we found new ways of working. It was quite incredible. What we also found, and now we also actually have the research to back that up, in the beginning there was a lot of doubt and a lot of uncertainty about productivity. But a lot of people already felt that actually they were quite productive because they didn't have to travel, they could do really focused work. And a lot of people felt this is working for me. But also organizations were experiencing that this is working much better than we had anticipated or that we could even hope for. And now we have actually data, we have studies, we even have experiments over the world that actually show that working from home and having this sort of hybrid arrangement, people are actually quite productive and often more productive than they were before they sort of shifted to hybrid working. And this has been for most people such a positive experience that they want that to remain, and they discovered this flexibility. They had a new way of combining their personal lives with their work lives. And a lot of people want that to stay, and they do not want to go back to what they used to be. Of course, not everything was uniformly positive. And this is one of those pictures that I probably do not even need to explain what I'm hinting at. So a lot of people experienced when they were working from home during COVID, that was incredibly difficult to organize because our workplace, to work from home or sort of a home office, was not designed for this. And we had children that needed to stay at home as well. We needed to homeschool them. We had our partners at home. We had our pets at home. And we were not prepared for this. We were not really organized for this. And so in the beginning, that was exhausting. That was chaos. But we quickly learned how to deal with this. And so I would say the bad part of this all was what we went through during COVID. That was never a real test of remote work because we were so unprepared for it. A lot of people shifted overnight. We didn't have our screens, we didn't have our computers, we didn't have a mic, we didn't have a webcam. And so we just needed to jump into it and make the best out of it. So we were a bit disorganized. So this was not the best test of what we could do. We also quickly learned that while we were working from home, it was difficult to meet new people, to connect with new people and exchange information. And we learned new words. We suddenly learned the value of serendipity. What we had thought as a normal phenomenon at work, that we sort of bump into each other in the hallway, on the stairs, having a coffee, we suddenly lost that unplanned encounter, and we missed it because we felt that this is where the important information comes from. This is where we are creative. This is where we build a social connection. So that was the bad part. And then let's be honest, there was an ugly part as well, right? And the ugly part is that we suddenly experienced that although we had a lot of flexibility working from home, it was exhausting, right? We all felt tired. We had a headache. We felt that we were putting in so many hours and that sometimes we didn't make a lot of progress. We felt that we were in these meetings back to back, and sometimes our main sort of exercise was clicking from one Zoom's meeting to another Teams meeting, right? And especially managers, people who were responsible for small teams, large teams, they experienced that, right? Because suddenly what felt normal to them, walking into, let's say, an office, they could quickly check in with their team members. They felt the temperature, they saw if something was going on. And that was very difficult because suddenly all those managers needed to schedule meetings, Teams meetings, and that took a long time, and they were completely exhausted. But it was not only for managers, right? A lot of people feel exhausted, and what we see in a lot of statistics, actually, we see some sort of a burnout epidemic. Maybe burnout epidemic is a bit of a strong word, but we see a lot of people that were struggling with their mental health and that needed some guidance, some support. And we see a lot of people that struggle with managing that shift to hybrid working and working from home. For a lot of people, that meant that the boundaries of your family life and your work life became blurred. And for some, that was a good thing. Some people felt very comfortable in doing that. For other people, that is a real struggle. We learned that for companies and managers, managing virtual work and virtual teams is very hard work. Very simply summarized, everything that you do takes more work. And everything that you learned as a manager in, let's say, the normal physical world is different in an online world. And a lot of managers that relied on their normal social skills, their presence, being able to be close to their team members, suddenly felt like they were sort of fighting a box match with their hands tied behind their backs. So that was difficult. And also companies felt the same thing. How do you build identity? How do you build culture if nobody's there and everyone is a bit isolated? And so that was the ugly part. And everyone is currently experimenting and trying to find solutions to this. And it's not an easy thing. And we'll get back to this. And so some of the things that we experienced was a lot of people felt isolated, sometimes even lonely. And we missed the normal unplanned social connections. And a lot of people felt a bit sort of anonymous in their organization. And what we see is that the ties, the connection, the social cohesion that people feel within their company is sort of deteriorating. And one of the potential results is we had this whole great resignation, and a lot of companies are a bit afraid. Are we losing people because we do not have that strong connection? We do not have that human connection. The same goes with the great resignation. Is actually also the result is that we are hiring a lot of people, but how do you onboard people when they're not physically present? And so a lot of people are trying to design online onboarding processes, but it's difficult, right? We've also learned that how we collaborate and how we share information is completely different in a hybrid world. There's this famous, and you probably heard about it, famous Microsoft study. So Microsoft logs everything that their employees do. So every meeting, every email, every text message, they were able to log that. And they were able to very precisely estimate what happens to our information sharing and collaboration when people move from a normal working environment, sometimes working from home, to a fully remote working environment. And they found three key patterns. One of them was that teams become static. And that means that normally if you work into a team, sometimes somebody leaves the team, new people get added, and you get this sort of rejuvenation. When people are working from home, the teams become very static. They don't change anymore. So that means that you don't have new oxygen in the team. The second thing that is happening is that teams become more inwardly focused. What we saw is that actually communication within the team is increasing, but we communicate less with outside external partners. And the third thing that they saw is actually that there was an increase in asynchronous communication, meaning that people will communicate with a time delay. They will use more chat messages or emails where people do not immediately respond to each other, and that creates a different dynamic in a team. Now, that was everything we learned throughout the COVID pandemic. Let's call it throughout a year and a half. And now we're in a good position to take stock. So where are we now exactly? And so these are quite recent figures up to October 2022. I'm lending or stealing those figures from the Work from Home research group that is led by Nick Bloom from Stanford University. His group and himself are doing great work on collecting global data on working from home, productivity, and how people prefer to work. And so what he actually found now is, and I'm sort of summarizing here, is that work from home is leveling off to sort of a pattern of 1 in 3 days that people are working from home. So a lot of companies have shifted to this model where people work 2 days from home and 3 days in the workplace. Interestingly, what you see is that work from home levels are much higher and increasing in city centers compared to rural areas. And so this will have huge implications for global city centers that normally were very vibrant, very busy with people working, coming in 5 days a week. And we see that that will have huge implications for rental space, for offices, and it's difficult to predict what will happen. But what we see is basically that people are less inclined to come in to work to the office 5 days a week, especially in busy city centers. And that is, of course, because of traffic. Okay. So if that is our current sort of position where we are, roughly summarized globally, so where do we go from here? First of all, I would say, do not doubt the impact of what is happening here. So what we saw is that at the beginning of this pandemic, everyone came with a lot of predictions and forecasts how the whole world would be changing. Basically, what we see now that a lot of those predictions are wrong. For instance, some of the predictions were that people would no longer shake hands, or one of the predictions was that people would no longer fly and people would travel less. We now see that all those predictions are wrong, but there's one prediction that is clearly accurate, and that is here to stay, and that is probably the biggest change as a result of the pandemic is how we work. And so I would say that what we are currently experiencing is a major shift that will probably change in the next years, probably in the next decade, not only where we work, but because it changes where we work and how we communicate, it will change the entire work experience and what work means in our lives and what sort of position work has in our lives. And so that will be a very drastic change. And I invite you to sort of have a parallel. Think back on, let's say, the mid-90s when email was just starting up, right? In the beginning, everyone saw that this is quite a change of how we could work, and people were sending a couple of emails instead of sending each other notes or faxes. But if you now think about what has happened to work, our work experience has fundamentally changed through online and communication. For a lot of people, email is their job, right? And so I expect that what is happening right now will create new jobs, but will also completely and drastically change how we experience work. And the way we are experiencing that change is a bit different. So what we see is basically, and this is again global patterns, but we see the same thing coming back over and over in different regions across the world, is that employers and managers on one hand and employees are experiencing something different. So we see a bit of a push to get back to the office from employers and managers, they would prefer people to come back to the office and be more present. And for instance, ideally, they would probably say 1 day a week working from home. I'm sort of roughly summarizing. While clearly employees have a different experience and a different preference, they are not ready to go back as it used to be, and they are somewhat concerned that their refound freedom is going to be taken away from them. And that is often how they think about it. It feels that throughout the COVID-19, throughout the pandemic, they sort of found a new flexibility and freedom. They were able to redesign their work lives and their private lives. And now they feel that their employers are pushing them to go back to the how it used to be, and they're not willing to do that. And so that is another driver of this great resignation that we talked about it. And so this disconnect is actually larger than most people think. It is larger than employers think, but it's probably also larger than employees think themselves. And so because a lot of employees, a lot of people have had time to experience that new work life, that new rhythm, those new patterns, they are suddenly re-evaluating what work means to them, what their careers mean to them, where they want to go in the next 5 to 10 years, what sort of jobs they want to do. And that re-evaluation was one of those explanations for that great resignation. Now, the problem is that the way a lot of companies are trying to solve this is just doing a survey and asking people, okay, what is the ideal solution? How many days do you want to be back in the office? The problem is that a lot of people do not know what they want, right? They know that they do not want to go back to how it used to be, but they have difficulty imagining a future work self. They have difficulty imagining how the future ideally would look for them. And so a lot of those surveys all find the same sort of hybrid model, 2-3 days. But when people are doing that, that does not necessarily make them happy. So this is a real challenge for a lot of us. And so why do we observe that, that variation, and why do we observe that people don't want to go back to the office? One of the biggest drivers, it's a no-brainer, is that people lost a lot of time in traffic and commuting. And so there's research, there's a famous study by Nobel Prize winner Daniel Kahneman, where he sort of examined how people use their time and how time use is related to daily well-being and satisfaction. And one of the things he found is actually that people are most dissatisfied and feel most unhappy during the day is during the commute. Basically, the commute is the most unhappy time that you can have in your life, right? And suddenly, through the pandemic, we've discovered that we do not need that commute, right? We win so much time. We've reclaimed time back in our lives. And you see that here for managers, but that is, of course, for everyone. People were able to reclaim commute time, and they were able to reinvest that time partly in personal activities, but actually also in work-related activities. And so that's why I often say both individuals and companies are winning from this, because there's high productivity and actually people are investing a bit more time in work as well. Going back to this sort of feeling of dissatisfaction, a lot of people are reevaluating what they want. And if they feel that what their workplace is currently offering is not what they want, they will leave. And that is what we had with the Great Resignation. But sometimes people do not leave, but they may mentally leave, right? So they might check out mentally. And this is, I think, sort of the basis of this whole, it's a bit of a hype and a fashion and a trend, of course, quiet quitting. Quiet quitting means that people will only do the minimal thing that is required in their employment contracts, but nothing more. And so it is a sort of a rebalancing, a resetting of the original psychological contract and the real contract they had with their employers. And they say, well, if you're not giving me what I want and what I ideally want in my life, like I experienced during that pandemic, I'm not giving you any more than I need to do. And so that is the basis of that quiet quitting. People stay in their jobs, but they don't want to invest any additional energy or effort. And so instead of just thinking about how many days should you be back into the office, I think companies need to redesign their whole work model, and they need to think about the whole employee experience. What does work mean in somebody's lives? What are you willing to offer them? What can you offer them? And so if we think about what companies will need to think about and reconsider is, for instance, employee mental health, because we see that as a major threat. And so, and companies have started doing this. And I was very happy to see that during the pandemic, that suddenly what had been a taboo in a lot of workplaces, mental health, suddenly leaders, managers were open to discussing mental health. And a lot of people felt sort of supported by this, that it became a real conversation about what they needed in mental health. What I was less happy about to see is that mental health initiatives were often sort of isolated initiatives. And for instance, you see a lot of mindfulness and meditation and a training around mindfulness, but these are very isolated efforts, while a really mentally healthy workplace is about work design and the job demands that are asked from people. And I think it needs a more fundamental approach if you would really want to design a mentally healthy workplace. To give you one example of a famous study here on the health effects from work stressors, and this study compared it to being exposed to secondhand smoke, right? And they actually saw, even for mental health, some of the stressors in the workplace have the same effect or even stronger effects than being exposed to secondhand smoke. And what you see, for instance, when you look at poor mental health, what is probably the key driver and the main risk is work-family conflict. And this is what we have experienced during this hybrid working and work from home experience. We see this work-family conflict, and it's difficult to manage. And again, Microsoft found a very interesting pattern in their analysis of all the online communication, all the emails, chat messages, team meetings they were analyzing. They saw suddenly that apart from the normal pattern, there was what they call a triple peak. And so normally you would have two peaks during the day of very intense information exchanges and collaboration. That would typically be around 10 a.m. in the morning, and it would be around 3 p.m. in the afternoon. Now, what they saw in this new hybrid working pattern is that suddenly you have a third peak in the evening around 10 p.m., which means that a lot of people are restarting work late in the evening and are again emailing with each other and setting up meetings. And that is, of course, something that we were not used to, and that can have a real impact on our mental health. And so a lot of companies have started thinking about, so how do you navigate this? How do you manage this? And not only companies, but also actually policymakers, governments and politicians have started thinking about, do we need to protect our citizens? Do we need to protect our people? And so, as you might have heard from my accent, I'm of course not Australian, but my roots are in Belgium. I'm Belgian, and so I come from a country where at the start in 2022, the government has decided that all public servants have the right to disconnect, which means that it is now a legal obligation or a legal license that people can disconnect in the evening, and from 5 p.m. onwards, they are no longer obliged or expected to respond to phone calls, team meetings, or emails. They have the right to disconnect. And a lot of European countries are having similar procedures and policies, and I think in France and in Portugal and Spain have similar policies. And it means that they want to sort of protect people from this always-on culture where people will keep on working till late in the evening, because those policymakers would think that that is the reason there's sort of this mental health epidemic or a burnout epidemic. The risk here is that it is often misunderstood as an obligation to disconnect. I do think that if we want to find new work models that work for us, for everyone, we need to allow people to design their own work-life balance and have flexibility. And for some people, that will mean that they are able to work in the evening, and I think we should not prevent them from doing so. What we need is that people have some sort of a virtual work hygiene. So it means that people understand the impact on their own lives, understand that not everything that they can do is often a good idea to do. And so we will need to almost re-educate people how to responsibly design their own work-life balance and give them flexibility in doing so. And so that does not necessarily mean that that will be the same for everyone, right? It means that for some people, there's a very sort of equal balance between work and life, and that could be a very natural 9-to-5 thing. But for other people, they may want to invest more in their work lives and have a different balance. And for some people, it means that there's flexibility, that everything is connected and intermingled. And there's actually very good research out there that basically says there's two profiles, there's two types of people. Some people are splitters. Splitters want to really separate work and life, and there are integrators. And those people actually like to integrate work and life, and they see work-life balance as a continual sort of going back and forth between both of them. All those things can be healthy as long as people sort of have the autonomy and the flexibility to arrange it in a way that works for them. Now, of course, that flexibility and that autonomy clearly closely relates to questions of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so this is some very important findings here. So one of the most important findings, I would say, is around gender differences in hybrid work. I'll generalize a bit, and a lot of people take issue with those findings, but globally, we saw a pattern in all the surveys and statistics that basically throughout the whole pandemic, women had experienced more mental health problems when working from home. And the reason was that women still have much more responsibilities in the household, have more responsibility taking care of children, and that put more demands and burden on them. And we saw that in the time use. There were time use differences between men and women. Women worked more from home, and they felt more stressed throughout this pandemic. So this sort of nice picture where there seems to be an ideal balance where both partners and families are combining tasks in the household. Basically, if you look at the broader patterns globally, this was not true, and this has not happened. And the risk is the following, is that a lot of people say, well, this flexibility and this hybrid workplace actually will be an advantage to women, because basically they can arrange their lives to be more flexible, to take care of their families and be at home for their children when they want to. And what we actually see is that while that is true, and we see that more women than men make that choice to work from home, to be available and to be present for children and the family, what we see is actually paradoxically that might undermine their career prospects. Because what we now see is that there's some sort of a proximity bias in the workplace, where managers and leaders are more inclined to give promotion opportunities to people that are physically in the workplace, that they see, that are proximal to them. And so that actually may put women at a disadvantage. Prudence.
Frederik, I've just got a question that's just popped in here. They've really asked about the productivity of the organisation, and certainly if the right to disconnect was there for the employees, are we not concerned about logging off at 5 and producing less output than they normally would?
That's a very good question, and basically I would say the verdict is still out there. So there is some research that shows that basically if people have a very clear boundaries around work and life, and they are able to maintain those boundaries, they are actually more productive during the hours that they work, as compared to just stretch out those working hours over the evenings and the weekends. Another piece of research actually shows that, for instance, you would even able to maintain that productivity if you work 4 hours a week and then have one more day that you would actually do not need to work. And so, but I'll be honest that there's a lot of mixed findings in that area. And so I would be a bit sort of reluctant to try to give a very definitive answer to that question.
Thank you. Maybe something that we can look at in 12 months' time, right, when we've found some findings about that. Thank you.
Yes, absolutely. So picking up where I left off the story is, so talking about the risk for sort of gender differences in the workplace, the same sort of risk is playing out for other what I would call diversity groups, or people with from a different diverse background. What we actually see, and this is very interesting, these are, and there's a couple of surveys out there, I just picked this one survey out here, is that we see that there's different preferences depending on diversity backgrounds in working from home. And we see, for instance, that depending on race and ethnicity, as you see summarized here, people have different preferences to work from home, and basically people from different ethnicities and backgrounds prefer to work more from home. And another survey, for instance, finds that people with disabilities were 11% more likely to prefer a hybrid work model. We also see that non-binary employees were 14% more likely to have a hybrid work model, and LGBTQ plus employees were also 13% more likely to prefer the hybrid work model. The question is, why is this? And so again, very cautious in trying to answer that question, because a lot of research is still out there and we don't have any final answer. But two studies that try to answer that found actually that for people from diverse backgrounds, when being present in the office, they often experience a lot of what we would call microaggressions. And so microaggressions are like comments and actions that that they would experience that suddenly and often unconsciously or unintentionally express prejudice towards a member of a marginalized group. That is often not something that people are aware of, but those people often experience those microaggressions, and that is really exhausting for them to deal with that, to cope with those things. And a second sort of pattern is that people from different backgrounds often feel a pressure to conform to the standard model, the dominant model in a workplace. And conforming to that standard model often requires to do a lot of emotional labor. And so they will need to manage impressions, adapt to what would be expected of them, to the stereotypes that are expected of them in the workplace. And that costs a lot of mental energy and exhaustion. And so when those people can benefit from a working from home, a hybrid model, that works much better for them. And for instance, we see for Black employees, for instance, in the US, there was a study that actually shows that they feel more belonging and they feel more included when they are able to work from home than they need to be physically present in the workplace. So that is really interesting. And we're still at the early stages of discovering how those patterns exactly work. But it shows that workplaces will need to be very aware of this. Does this mean that we all just need to go home and work from home and that this is the end of the physical workplace? I don't think so. Because let's be honest, we also experience the downsides of fully working remotely and working from home. And it's difficult to imagine that we will have businesses and workplaces, except maybe in some tech industries, that will be entirely without face-to-face contact. It's difficult to build that sense of identity and belonging if people do not come regularly or on certain moments into the workplace. We know that information exchange, problem solving, creativity benefit from face-to-face contact and conversations. We know that organizational identity, onboarding, norms, they require sort of proximity and close connections. And so what I expect is basically that we will move to a different way of organizing work that will focus on two core building blocks. And those building blocks will be, as I mentioned earlier, flexibility. So basically, we will give people full flexibility about how they want to work with some requirements. And the second thing is we will focus more on, instead of physical proximity, on psychological proximity. That means that we can be close to people and connected to people without needing to meet them in person every day, right? We will find new ways to do that. Now, that flexibility will come with some sort of accountabilities. We will need to give people more autonomy, and we will need to trust them, right? Instead of constantly controlling or monitoring people, we will need to trust them, and we will need to more focus on their results and how they contribute to organizations. But we will also require them to take accountability and social responsibility. It means that if I choose to work from home, I need to be aware that my absence, my physical absence, has implications for the productivity of other people in the workplace that are there. Because sometimes people need me to be there because I have information that they might need. And so it means that I get flexibility, but I also need to be aware that that impacts others. And the third thing that we will need to think about is what we call social capital. Instead of just thinking about my own skills and competences, which is human capital, we need to think about social capital, and social capital are the connections between people, the things you do not see, the hidden connection between people, but they are very important. And social capital actually means I know who knows what in the organization, and I know who to contact and connect, and I have the relationship. I've built those relationships with other people so that I'm able to connect with those. And that is difficult to do online, but we will learn how to do so, and we will bring people back to the workplace to build that social capital, right? And so that will require redesigning workplaces. Okay, I'll try to summarize this whole story. I know it's a long sort of story about where we have been and where we're going. And I'll try to give you 4 takeaways about what we need to remember when we are trying to redesign the workplace. The first one is flexibility. What we've learned now is that flexibility is core to the future. People really learn to value that flexibility, and they do not want to give that flexibility back. And especially for diverse groups, that will be incredibly important, because we need to make sure that we do not make any assumptions about diverse groups, how they want to work and how they will use that flexibility. And so they will embrace it if we offer it. The second thing is, if we want to make sure that that flexibility works, we will need to reevaluate how we organize work and how peers collaborate. So it does not mean that every individual just decides for their own what they will do, because then that will be a complete failure, right? It means that we will give people flexibility, but in a new work model where people have new norms and ways of collaborating. The third thing that we will need to consider is, if we work in different ways together with more flexibility, the way we design offices will need to change, right? Our offices are designed for a completely different world. We will need to redesign workplaces to support diverse, flexible, and tech-enabled workforces. So I think there's still some work to do, but a lot of companies have already made good progress there. And then the last thing is that is a psychological aspect. It is not only about the technological and the material redesign of the workplace, but also the psychological aspects. It means about what is the purpose of this company, what is the purpose of this workplace. If we want people to come to the workplace and work together, they need to have a good reason, right? If they're working from home and they're very productive and focused, we need to give them a reason why they want to come back, because they feel a sense of belonging, a sense of inclusion, a sense of social cohesion and identity. And so that means that we need to create a different narrative of what a workplace is and what it can mean for people. So these were my 4 takeaways. I'll stop it here and we can continue the conversation. I would just say, for people who want to read more, if you scan that QR code, you'll find a webpage with a lot of links to things that I've written and interviews I've done around those topics. Prudence, back to you.
Thank you so much. There's so much great information there, and I'm sure, like myself, all of the attendees today will have learned quite a bit about where we're going and what we're hoping to achieve as organisations in the new model moving forward. I've got a couple of questions here that have come through that I might be able to ask you, of course. So, what do you think the best way is to improve employee behaviours after COVID-19? What do you think the best way is to engage with our employees in this fashion?
So I do think what we've sort of lost is the ability to have a real conversation. So we think that we can design or sort of shape employee behavior by incentives and by norms. And I see what is happening throughout COVID and afterwards. I saw a lot of CEOs sending out long emails, and often very, very well written emails about what they value, what they've achieved, how to celebrate things together. But people have information overload, and this is a sort of one-way communication, one-to-many communication. What we now need to relearn is the art of real conversations, one-to-one, one-to-many, many-to-one, in a sense that people feel really listened to, have been able to give input in where they see the company going, and then design a model where people feel, okay, I've been listened to. What I see in most of the surveys right now is, and that explains part of that quiet quitting, is people feel that they are not being listened to, that there's not a real conversation. They get emails, they get instructions, but they feel, when will people listen to me? And so I think the skill of the future for CEOs is digital communication in a genuine and authentic sense. I sometimes see examples, fantastic examples. For instance, I saw here in Woolies, which is a chain of supermarkets in Australia. During COVID, I saw the CEO sending emails every week, but in the next email, he always came back to how people responded to that emails and how he would take that into account in a decision, how they had listened and what his next step would be. In doing so, he really showed that I'm sending you how I think, but I'm listening and I'm changing my own mental model in response to what you've been telling me. That is the skill for the future, I think.
Yeah, excellent. So it's really getting back to basics and using those primary communicational skills to be able to talk to your employees, and then still be using, of course, these new habits that we have to use, such as your emails and so forth, to really push through our points. So another question that I've got for you is, in regards to the hybrid working place, have you got any tips and tricks about junior staff that need to be in a working environment, of course? And we all know that, especially here in Australia, we're all looking for staff all the time. So if anyone wants to come work for us in Australia, please come aboard. But how are we actually going to be able to train people moving forward in this hybrid environment? Do you have any tips and tricks around that?
That's a very good question, and I almost think that we need to we need to reinvent our onboarding models, because we're hiring a lot of people and sometimes we've never seen them, right? And at the same time, there's one group of people that we find in those surveys that is eager to go back to the workplace. And these are, let's say, young graduates, young starters, because they are there's two things that are going on. First, often their home offices are non-existent because they often have, we don't know, we don't make assumptions about where they work from, but a lot of those people are working from sort of small apartments, one-bedroom apartments. They do not have the whole equipment. They want to go back to the office because that is a better way to work, but also they want to learn from more senior people. And so we'll need to find a way to do so. So one of the things that means is that you need to create awareness in more senior people that they need to come to the workplace because their simple presence is so important for those new starters, those newcomers. And so we need to find models where we explain that even going beyond the normal mentoring relationship. So normally a newcomer would get one mentor that is responsible for onboarding, learning the culture, learning the language and the mindsets. Probably we need to expand that a bit and saying, look, this is a team or a network that is now responsible for the onboarding of that individual. And as a group, as a network, you need to find a sort of an arrangement where that newcomer feels supported in person at the workplace, that there's always someone present, there's a handover, there's a sort of a whole journey to take them through. And so we can no longer rely on almost an natural, organic onboarding process. It used to be people came in, everyone is present, you would talk to them and you would learn naturally. Now we will need to be deliberate and design an onboarding journey with fixed time points that we check in with people to make sure that they are sort of learning those new skills.
Excellent. Now, I love the words that you used using the network and having, you know, a couple of people to be mentoring these junior staff rather than one, because you're right, one was really the norm, certainly was in a lot of workplaces that I have dealt with. Great questions coming through, guys, so keep them coming through. We've got another one here. How are companies practically able to evolve their cultures to ensure they continue to attract and retain high-performing employees?
That is a difficult question, and I'll explain why I almost never try to answer that question. Because culture, it is so difficult to grasp. One of my colleagues, Denise Rousseau, a management professor in the US, she once defined culture as trying to define a culture. It's like trying to nail jelly to the wall, right? It does not work. It is so difficult to pinpoint. And the thing is, you know a good culture when you see it, but that does not mean that you can easily influence it. So what I would say, do not focus on culture, focus on behavior, right? We know that we can influence and shape individual behaviors in groups, individuals, groups. That works, right? We can have conversations, we can set norms of what we expect, how we talk about performance, how we talk about expectations, how we talk about mental health. We know that we can sort of create a psychological safety in a team where people feel safe to speak up. These are things that have a lot to do with how leaders are open and authentic and genuine and talking about those things. If you can create those behaviors, people will start copying those behaviors in the team. And if you then reinforce those messages and try to scale them, at some point, the whole culture will change. But if you think that you can have a top-down program, strategic program of changing a culture, I assure you, it will fail. There are so many failed culture strategic efforts. Don't try to do it, especially now when we're working in a hybrid mode, because the distance, psychological distance with teams and employees is further away. You need to give autonomy and make sure that people create that psychological safety and those norms in their teams. And then it is contagious and it will scale up to the whole company.
I love that answer. You're absolutely right. It is contagious, good culture. So some other questions that I've got here, which is an interesting one. Of course, we've got some employees that due to their roles, it's really not flexible and they have to be in the office. Do you have any thoughts around, you know, what we can do with these employees that want to have flexible, I suppose, working environments, but unfortunately, due to the organisation structure or where they are, they have to actually be in the office? Have you got any thoughts around that?
It's an excellent question. I'm very happy that somebody raised this, because we have a problem with this whole hybrid working. The people that are, why does this get so much attention? Because the people that are writing about this are journalists that are working from home and academics that are working from home, and it's easy for us to work from home. And we talk about our own experience and we're intrigued by that. But let's be honest, the estimates are that about 60% of the jobs are not able to work from home, right? If you are a nurse or a doctor, a physician working in a hospital, in an emergency unit, if you work in retail, if you work in a factory, if you are driving people around in cars, if you work as a butcher, as a baker, you cannot work from home. So the risk is that this sort of installs a new inequality. And you sense that a lot, that people that are not able to do so are struggling with this and are suffering, that they do not have that refound freedom. What I would say, though, is, and we have a lot of research on that, in every job and every role, there is scope to give people more autonomy in how they do their work, how they make decisions on their time schedules. And so it is not a cop-out to say, well, some jobs just simply cannot work from home, so we keep on doing what we've always been doing. So actually, when people ask, how do you design a healthy, mentally healthy workplace, I can give you the recipe. We know exactly what the recipe is. It is job design and giving people more autonomy and sort of finding their own balance in job demands and job resources. We know how to do this. And so giving people autonomy and flexibility can also happen in a physical workplace.
Absolutely. That's some really, really good points. I actually read some articles recently about performance and of the staff that would be sitting in the offices and would like to have that flexibility and understanding where they want to go into in the future, and making sure that we're investing in their process of actually moving on into the future to therefore make them feel more comfortable about being in the workplace for 100% or close to 100% of their time. So something else that people might want to take onto board. I've got a question here about, I suppose, the hybrid model and virtual reality technology, of course, which is a really interesting one that is popping up everywhere. I think that we're all going to be seeing and feeling different things, of course, into the future. But are you looking at thinking that offices will go this way to a higher percentage than they are normally? And is this something that we should be investing and focusing on into the future?
It almost feels like this magical crystal ball thing, right? If you think about VR, and when I see the clips and the experiments with that, it is amazing. So I'm pretty confident that there will be experiments, it will happen. And I think I do not expect VR to replace the physical experience. I do think it will be used to enhance the digital experience. So the way we are talking right now, probably within 2 to 3 years, that will no longer be a simple Zoom screen, right? We will experience ourselves in a sort of 3D virtual reality experience, and it will feel much more alive. But I do think it will not replace physical contact. And I do think there's still something unique in how our brains are wired. You cannot sort of undo evolution, right? The way we create a bond between people, having real eye contact, is really difficult to replace and change that. So what I do expect is that our virtual experience will be much more enhanced, but I do think there will still be a need for people to come together to have a real human connection.
Yeah, can't miss that human connection that you can get from just sitting across the table from someone. So last question that I've got for you today. Oh, no, we've got two more, sorry. One of them was about office locations, and I suppose this is more of a comment than a question, of course, but what do you think about people working in different offices to different, I suppose, states or countries? So here in Australia, you know, we've got a lot of people that might be wanting to work in Sydney, and then they've got clients in Melbourne or something. Do you think this hybrid workplace then enables us as organisations to be looking at that for employees a little bit further?
Absolutely, and it's as you mentioned, it's already happening. It's gone off during the pandemic, and people have moved out of the city centers. If we look at, for instance, I recently saw some data on New York. We see that there's probably a 40% reduction in need for office space because people have just moved out and are working in different places. Yeah. It is not only within the country, it is probably also across countries, right? You see a lot of, for instance, tech companies that are recruiting overseas because they basically say, I'm looking for talent wherever that may be, and the competition for that talent is so fierce that we will grab them wherever we can find them. And so people will be hired wherever they work. And I think cross-national, cross-boundary work arrangement will happen. There's a lot of fiscal and legal challenges, but it's already happening, right? What I do expect that companies will try to work around, and so this is my long-term expectation, is that the shape of cities will change. And for instance, here in Sydney, but for instance, also in Paris, there's a lot of talk about the 30-minute city or the 15-minute city. And it basically means that you'll be able to live and work in a space of 15 minutes or 30 minutes, and you will be able to get everywhere walking or by bike. And so that means that you will have company headquarters, but then every company will have smaller hubs closer to neighborhoods where people are living. And so people will still be able to check in, work with other colleagues, but maybe more in regional hubs. And so I think that might also change the configuration of large cities.
Yeah, that's a great idea. I haven't thought of that one before. I've got to say, if anyone offered me a job in Barbados and wanted me to sell credit insurance in Australia, I'm all up for it. So if anybody wants me to do that, I'm there. Just one last question that we've got here. We are losing, of course, in the insurance industry, colleagues, unfortunately, to competitors because of higher salaries and hyper flexible workplaces, I suppose. With that, is there anything else that you can think of that we might be able to combat, I suppose, this retention of our employees in that type of market?
So the whole retention issue and the war for talent is basically industry-wide, but also globally. The fun thing is, so I live a bit across countries. You know that I live a bit in the UK, in Italy, in Belgium, France, and everyone comes to me and say, oh, here in our country, it's terrible. We can't find anyone. But basically, it's a global thing, right? It is a post-pandemic sort of almost an economic issue. So everyone is competing for the same sort of talents. So that research that I mentioned from Nick Bloom, that Stanford professor, he basically did a very interesting study. And he asked people, so how much salary would you be willing to sort of give back in turn for more flexibility? And basically it shows that people are willing to give back 10% of their salary if they have 1 or 2 more days that they would be able to work from home. I'm not saying that this is a magic formula, but it shows a psychological principle, is that people have sort of realized that salary and money is not everything, and that their work-family balance experience, being able to sort of shape their own lives around work, is much more important than that, let's say, 10% additional salary. And so what companies need to learn here is that it does not make sense to keep on competing only on the basis of salaries and financial issues, but they will need to redesign their employee experience. And I think it's a very strong offer. And this is not only about creating a nice workplace, right? I think if you go now to employees and say, look, if you come and work with us, I have a long-term career development plan for you. So this is not about you just doing this job. I have a whole journey for you that you can take. These are the milestones for the next 5 years. You'll have an opportunity to get promoted. You have an opportunity to gain this sort of experiences. We will support you in doing so. We will invest in your development, in your skills, in your mentoring. We will train you. We will give you new opportunities. I think these sort of offering, that is where companies are now making a difference. And so if you're just thinking about, here's 2 days working from home, and this is your salary package, it will be very difficult because you will lose out to companies that are offering a sort of a whole whole employee experience package.
Yeah, really good points there. I know for myself, you know, you always want to know where you can go, and having a boss or a company that's invested in your growth is extremely important. Frederik, thank you so much for your time today. I'm sure, just like myself, the attendees today have gained a lot of interest in not only the thoughts, but also the thoughts for the future, which is the big one, of course. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today and for your valuable questions. It really has been fabulous. And I would like to say thank you again, Frederik. It has just been fabulous. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
But I hope that everyone has a fabulous afternoon or evening or morning, wherever you guys are. And please be aware, of course, this will be available on the Dive In website for you guys by the end of the week. So if you do wish to watch this again with all of Frederik's valuable tips and tricks, and of course all of his learnings, then please do hook on to the recording. But I hope everyone has a fabulous day. Thank you so much.